start us off today with a prayer. This prayer comes from the Tent of Nations. So any of you who were on any of the Israel trips had the chance to be with the folks at Tent of Nations, and they provided us with a prayer for peace in Israel and Palestine. God of comfort, send your spirit to encompass all those whose lives are torn apart by violence and death in Israel and Palestine. God of justice, give strength to those whose long work for a just peace might seem fruitless now. Strengthen their resolve. God of love, we lift up Palestine and Israel, its people, its land, its creatures. God of hope, we lift up the cities of the region, so long divided, yet so filled with life and creativity. God of mercy, even now work on the hearts of combatants to choose life over death, reconciliation over retaliation. God of the nations, give wise discernment to those making decisions to pursue peace. Provide them insight into fostering well-being, freedom, and thriving for all. Teach all of us to resolve injustices with righteousness. Strengthen our faith in you, O God of all flesh, even when we don't have clear answers, so that we may still offer ourselves non-violently for the cause of peace. Amen. Gentlemen, take it away.
Is this working? Yeah, okay, no, good. For some reason you can't hear us, raise your hand at some point. Can you hear there? Okay, we'll have to hold it close to our mouths, I think. Well, good morning. Ed and I are going to share with you what we learned from reading a couple of books on Israel and Palestine. We read these as part of a men's book club in our building, right across the street, actually. And then somehow got the idea that it might be a good thing to share with you all. Somehow. We would like to ask you to hold questions, because in this area of the world, there's a lot of history and we have a lot to go through. And we'll see, hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end. And I might mention, thank you, Gerald, for setting this up so you can see it a little bit better, but the photos do not come out very well. All the photos on here I took almost exactly a year ago. I was part of the third FPC trip to the Holy Land, and some of my partners are in here with me today, I can see.
Notice that Ross and I don't do this for a living. So we're with Ed's help. We're trying.
Okay, these are the two books, and I'm going to be representing the Palestinian book, and that's going to be representing the Israeli book. So here's the Palestinian book. And the reason we chose these two books are they were both on the New York Times paperback bestsellers list just a few weeks ago. So we thought maybe if they're that popular, they must be good, and they were, actually. This book, the second book is called The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017, by Rashid Khalidi. Khalidi is an academic. He's a professor at Columbia University in New York City. He's taught at the American University in Beirut, Lebanon, and at the University of Chicago. He's got degrees from Yale and Oxford. He's a pretty smart guy. It's a pretty tough, a little bit tough book to read. The academics, when they write, they're a little bit dry, but still it isn't bad. Let's see. He's got a lot of family history actually in the area. His great uncle was the mayor of Jerusalem in the year 1900. And by the way, if you can see, we're at the wrong page on that. See if we can do that. Yeah, you really can't see this picture, but it is the Jordan River, which is a very narrow river. Actually, you might think Jordan River's got to be large, but it's not. And so that's what that is in that picture.
See, my book was completely different. This is from Noah Tishby, And unlike the book that Ross was describing, which was very academic, this book is written by a 48-year-old woman who actually has quite a resume herself. She started in the entertainment business in Israel and then came to Hollywood and lives in part of the time in Los Angeles. And she's written the book, and the title is A Simple Guide to the Most Misunderstood Country on Earth, because she was struck by Americans and other people that she would run into, how especially many of the younger people really don't know the history of Israel. And so the way this book is written, it's the opposite of an academic. It is written in just a vernacular, like conversation. And she will even pepper it with expressions and even an off-color word here and there. But she's describing the birth of Israel and her family's experience. Now, as I said, she is, her background, she was an actress, a model, a TV producer in Israel and a TV producer in the United States. And her production company is called Noah's Ark. Her first name is Noah, so it's Noah's Ark. And with this, she talks about her family. You know, much like the other author, she's rooted also in Israel because her grandmother and grandfather.
Nope, Oliver.
Okay, her grandmother and grandfather immigrated to Israel in 1920s. And the families from her background come from Belarus, come from Russia, come from Poland. The ones that did not immigrate to Israel were all murdered in the Holocaust. So you have all of that background with her. And so the next slide here, okay, is why do we volunteer to share this? The short version is that Ross talked me into it. He said that I need it. But actually, you know, this conflict is here and now. This is not some academic thing. People are dying. There is the conflict is it got a lot of negative that has happened and potentially can. And as Christians, we have an interest because we have a human interest because we want to promote peace and we want to eliminate suffering. And we want to be, if we can, be part of the problem, not part of the problem, but part of the solution. Many of us have opinions. It's very complicated, but what we were trying to do is share some information, and perhaps through information, we can get discernment.
Okay, just to get oriented slightly, most of you probably are familiar with Israel and the surrounding areas. But over on the left is a smaller map of Israel. The bottom half of it is desert. Israel is really a small country. It's about the size of New Jersey. And if you look at the what's surrounding them, well, you have the Mediterranean Sea on the west. Then you have Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, all Arab countries on all sides, except for the Mediterranean. You look at the blow up here on the right side, what's kind of predominant is the West Bank. It's really the West Bank of the Jordan River. So the Jordan River flows from the Sea of Galilee in the north to the Dead Sea in the south. The West Bank is much more complicated than it looks like there, and I'll show you another view of it in just a little bit. And then Jerusalem is kind of in the middle, in the lower part. Bethlehem's right around there. Tel Aviv's to the left. Gaza's in the bottom left, or the west side. The Golan Heights, which is pretty well known, and a conflicted area is up on the top right. So that's kind of just an overview of geography. Okay, our format for doing this is going to be two columns. The left column is Palestine, and that's my part, and the right column is Israel, and that's Ed. So we'll start with Palestinians. Just as a foundation, for centuries, Palestine was an Ottoman Empire province with no clear boundaries. So they were ruled by the Ottoman Empire for centuries. There's been this is our author's quote, there's been a colonial war against indigenous population. So all those words are carefully chosen: colonial, indigenous population. The Arabs have been here for an awful long time. For over a century, Palestinians have been depicted in a condescending way. You'll see some of that as we go through this history. Carol.
Now, for the perspective from Israel, in terms of who is indigenous, they would argue that they're pretty indigenous themselves. This is the ancient Jewish kingdom. Everybody in this room are familiar with the Old Testament, so we could go back as far back as you want to. But one of the things that is included in this slide is the kingdom 1500 BC. The temple, Solomon's temple, was 930 to 970 BC. And so the Jews have been here. The name Israel, the name Jerusalem, all of this was the ancient and indigenous area of the Jews. So they both are claiming to be indigenous. A little complicated, isn't it? So now the history, the author goes through the history. So this hasn't always been just real straightforward. And these are some of the kingdoms. I think maybe all of them, but here we go. So Jews, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Crusaders, Muslim Caliphate, Egyptians, Ottomans, British, last but not least, the United Nations for about 2 years. So there was her point of view, and I think it's historically accurate. There was never really a state of Palestine. It was a province, an Ottoman province, but the boundaries were never specific, and there was never an actual state of Palestine. And the contention that the Israelis have is they are not a colonialist actor. They're a refugee nation. That people didn't go there to expand, say the British Empire. They escaped to have a refuge for their country, for their population.
Okay, now for the 100 Years' War on Palestine, the first historical chapter is titled First Declaration of War, 1917 to 1939. This is not literal. There wasn't a declaration of war. This is the convention this author is using to go through history. You'll see that he has 6 declarations of war as we go through history. And they're kind of in line with the title of his book, 100 Years War on Palestine. So that's how we've organized this material, and we've taken the Israeli material and blended it in time-wise with these chapters. So the first declaration is really an important time frame. It's around World War I. So 1917 to 1939. Have you ever heard the Balfour Declaration? Some of you have. And that was written in 1917 at the beginning of World War I by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour. And it called for a national home for Jewish people in Palestine. He did not mention the Arabs, who were 94% of the population at that time. And kind of his incentive for doing that is to get Jewish support for Britain in World War I. And then in 1922, the League of Nations was founded in 1920 after World War I. They formed a lot of what's called mandates around the world, actually. Pacific, a lot in this region, and they were dealing with pieces of land that were kind of left over after World War I. For example, Palestine was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, which was a loser in World War I, and so they ceased to exist. So what do you do with Palestine? Well, you give it to Britain, is what you do. So this mandate for Palestine had Britain rule this area between 1922 and 1948. So England was the ruling government for Palestine. The Jewish population increased in this from 1922 to 26 from 6% to 18%, because this was kind of the intent, you know, that the Britons would help this become a Jewish homeland. A couple of other things that happened in this vicinity. One is 1933, the rise of the Nazis. More people immigrated into, more Jewish people immigrated into Palestine. Another event in general was from 36 to 39, there was a Palestinian revolt because of all these Jewish people coming in and their lack of any control. Well, the Britons in control of them and the Jewish people are coming in, so they revolted.
So trying to match this from the Israeli perspective, at this point in time, we move into Zionism. And so where did Zionism come from? And the first bullet point we're talking about is anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism's been around a long time. And it's been around probably 1,000 years or more. And it was really rampant in Europe, really rampant in really the whole world. Jews were trying to find a place to live during this period of time. Many Jews were trying to assimilate into the culture or the nationality, but periodically, whether it was Spain or whether it was England or whether it was the Arab countries, the persecution of Jews was pretty constant. And so in the 1800s, the idea of returning to Jerusalem, returning to Israel, called Zionism. And Theodor Herzl is given the credit for officially in a meeting in Switzerland in the late 1896, when they officially started Zionism. There were actually some Jewish communities before this that were actually located in Israel, but the idea of returning to their homeland. It's interesting, like in our country, you know, might the American Indians come back and claim their property. And there actually is a program I found. By the way, when you're doing this, it makes you just dig into all kind of other that the Department of Interior for 10 years had like $1.4 billion for Native Americans to repurchase their land. And I read an article, one tribe in Texas. So little bits and pieces, they are, you know, coming back to purchase. And that's the point with Zionism. All of this land during this period of time where the Jews are moving was purchased either from Arabs that lived there or from people that owned the land that didn't live there, the old absentee landlords. And there was a lot of that in Palestine at this point in time. So the Jews began to purchase the land legally. And one of the really interesting parts of the book on Israel is talking about the Israeli culture. And she talks about the kibbutz and kibbutzes. I was trying to figure out if that's the plural. I think it is. And but these are communal villages that we're familiar with, agriculturally oriented, where everyone got paid the same. They all worked together. They reared their children as a group. And it came out of, again, these refugees, and they got to be really hard scrabble kind of folks. This is the frontier. And so a lot of these early Zionist Jewish folks are pretty tough characters because they're coming from the oppression in their former countries. Now they're scratching out in a completely different climate, a community. And both of her grandparents, the grandmother and grandpa, grew up in kibbutz. And she talks about how that is still part of kind of who she is and who many people in Israel are. Finally, the Holocaust. There was, gosh, you know, the movement for Zionism, it's moving along. But then when the Holocaust happened, my goodness, then just there were, after World War II, hundreds of thousands, and actually, I think overall, there was like 11 million people displaced after World War II. People around the world. And because of the Holocaust, then now the Jewish population is exploding. And so that's going to set up the next slide and the next direction of where we're going. But the Holocaust casts a shadow on the Jewish people. It makes them scared. You know, people tried to eliminate them, kill them, and they killed 6 million. So it's there in whatever conversation you have.
See if Gerald can find the right button. There's just a few photos that are dealing with the Palestinian perspective. Hard to see in this room. And the bottom left is a Christian Palestinian leader who we met with. We met with 2 Christian Palestinian leaders. We were there a year ago, and they were really impressive individuals. They had deep faith. And he was telling us about living in Bethlehem in the West Bank, you know, and that's it's very hard to get out of Bethlehem if you're a Palestinian. And so we were really impressed with the issues that Palestinians can live under in this controlled environment of the West Bank. On the right side actually is a wall and a guard tower, just a few steps from where we met with him, keeping him and his friends in, you know, and not allowing them to go out. In the upper right is a settlement. You've heard perhaps of settlements. These are towns or villages that are established by Israeli people in the West Bank, in these areas where they not supposed to be, but they go grab land, and then they build a pretty nice town, and it might have a wall around it. We saw several of these when we were driving around on the bus. And they believe this land was theirs. It was given to them by God. You know, some of them will believe that. So we saw that, and that, of course, that's not real popular with the Palestinians. And then up in the upper left, we went to a nature preserve in the, what's it called, the high area, Golden Heights. And so you can actually look down on Syria and on Lebanon from there. And lo and behold, they have a statue, looks like a silhouette of a soldier pointing a gun out at those folks. So that's, for whatever that's worth, that's another thing to observe. Okay, Gerald. Okay, now we're moving to the second declaration of war, so to speak, in the second chapter, large chapter. After World War II, power goes to the US and the USSR. The future of Palestine goes to UN Resolution 181, which divides Palestine into what he says is a large Jewish state and a smaller Arab state. In 1947, now we're really entering a really key time frame, because this is really the founding of Israel, which Ed will detail somewhat. Starting in 1947, Zionist paramilitary groups forced Palestinians from several cities, so they all suddenly show up in force. Arab countries, neighboring countries, send troops, but they are defeated. 720,000 Palestinians are displaced. They leave and go to neighboring Arab countries. Well, actually, they're not that welcomed, but that's where they left. 160,000 stayed and are now Israeli citizens. Today, 5.5 million descendants of these people that left are in refugee camps around Israel. And actually 2 million are Israeli citizens. So I was surprised to see that 20% of the population of Israel are Muslims, they're Arabs. So is 80, kind of an 80-20 rule. They talk about this time period as the Nakba, which means catastrophe. Looking a little further forward, the Gaza Strip was not involved here. They were governed by Egypt at this point until 1967.
Okay, now from the Israeli perspective, this is the Palestinian author says declaration of war. This is a really critical time because this is the partition plan, 1947 to 1949. And it's after World War II, the United Nations trying to divide up, where new countries in Africa, in the Middle East, and actually the same year that all of this is going on, India and Pakistan are being divided. And India and Pakistan, the best information is like 1 million people died in that partition. And again, religion played a role between the Muslim and Hindu factions. And so that's the same year that this is going on. There's a lot of stuff going on right after World War II. And where we are here is the UN partition plan. The UN partition plan was voted by the United Nations. The vote was 33 to 13 to 10 abstentions. The United States and the Soviet Union both voted for it. When that was established, there was to be a Jewish state and an Arab state. And then the area around Jerusalem and Bethlehem was supposed to be an international city. So the United Nations, as mentioned King Solomon earlier with the temple, they tried to be Solomon. They tried to split the baby. And it is a very jagged line, okay, Arabs over here, Jews over there, because there was, the Jews and Arabs weren't getting along. So they, instead of one country, they have two countries, a lot like India and Pakistan. So they tried to draw the line. The Jews said, yes, we'll go forward. The Arabs said no. And in fact, all the Arab countries around Israel said no. And if you declare your independence, we're going to invade you. So, I thought it was interesting that they said a war on Palestine, but it was actually the Arabs who attacked Israel. So that the Declaration of Independence from Israel is the day after the British leave. And I'll read a little bit of that declaration, because I think it's interesting as to what Israel's about. It says, the state of Israel, it will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all of its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will assure complete equality of social and political rights for all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions and will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. So it starts off very, and actually it's very liberal, Western liberal ideas. And to this day, they still have elections. They still have the freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of press. It's messy. We read it in the paper. They're as bad as they're worse than we are, as bad as we are. But they have elections regularly. And they pick wrong people sometimes, like we pick wrong people sometimes. So it is a Western democracy, basically. And as Ross just pointed out, about 21% of the people that live in Israel are Arabs. And they are the third largest party. One of the Arabs actually is on the Supreme Court in Israel. So, go back. So with all the and all the Arab nations attack Israel. 10 months later, a truce is signed. They lose. And what happens is now the Israelis now of the old, what the British had, that mandate. Now the Israelis control 77% of that. And so the space for the Arabs gets smaller because when they attacked, they lost major areas within Israel. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So at the very end, though, here conflict remains. Despite this war, and it was a bloody, nasty thing, it's a truce. They didn't sign a peace that Israel really demands security. They're not gonna, that's a demand. And the Arabs demand land back to 1948. And so both sides, it's a truce, but they're not happy. And next is the map. And this shows, and it's a little hard to see, but the area in green is the area that was given to Israel for the new state in 1947. And the area in orange, sort of a burnt orange, I guess here, is all the land that was given to the Arabs. As the percentage wise, it's like 56% of the territory went to the Jewish nation, but it includes the southern part, which is the Negev Desert. So it didn't have as much arable land. But the Jewish population was increasing rapidly, and the Jewish groups thought that they could make that desert bloom. So they took that. That's why they agreed to this. The Arabs did not. The areas that were reserved for the Arabs, the very north is up near Lebanon, also the West Bank, all the West Bank. And then at that area where Gaza is, but notice Gaza, oops, here. Yes, I should use this. Oh yeah, this is Gaza right here. This whole strip down here was included as well. And so this is the partition plan. And so as far as Israel is concerned, if the Arabs had taken that, then they would have had their state and Israel would have had its state, and Jerusalem and Bethlehem were to be administered as an international city, and then they would go from there. But because the Arabs never accepted it, there was never an Arab state established.
Okay, now we're going to the third declaration of war. Now we're getting to things that I kind of actually remember slightly, at least in terms of like 6-Day War. I kind of remember that term a little bit. The 6-Day War was when Egypt, Jordan, and Syria attacked Israel. But they're decisively beaten, I guess in 6 days. The US now fully backs Israel. And a result of all this was the UN Security Council Resolution 242 in 1967, which legitimized 1949 boundaries. It talked about 48 boundaries. I'm not sure, they must have been tweaked a little bit. But again, Palestinians are not mentioned in this resolution. We'll look a little bit more at that in a bit. Looking forward a bit, then in 1975, this was highlighted by the Palestinian author. 3 Palestinian Liberation Organization leaders were assassinated in their homes. And then Camp David occurred with Jimmy Carter. And that was a treaty between Egypt and Israel. So the Palestinians are not involved in that treaty. I mean, I have a really good memory that that's a real positive thing, and it was, but not necessarily for the Palestinians. So that's some history there.
From the Israeli perspective, it's sort of 1967. I do remember 1967. And here it comes again. All the Arab countries attack Israel again. And so they win. And now Israel gets larger. they take the entire West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. And all of this now becomes greater Israel, because from the Israeli perspective, is every time the Arabs attack, and one of the things, there's a couple of things that they were saying, upon their attack, we're gonna drive you into the sea. There's going to be, we're gonna eliminate this Zionist government. We're gonna get rid of all those Jews. Well, they lose. And then Israel, because again, this is a small country. They now say, okay, we'll take more land. So there they are. UN Resolution 242 afterwards says there's a concept here. We'd like you to use the 1949 line, which, by the way, if you remember, is a little bit bigger than the 1947 line. So do one on that, but trade land for peace. So while this sits there, Ross talked about the assassinations from the Mossad, and there was also the Olympic massacre of the Israelis. I think most of us remember that was the athletes and the coaches, and there was all this terrorism going back and forth. This was not a happy place. Yom Kippur War in 1973, again, this time it's launched by Egypt, by Jordan, and Syria. They go after Israel again. This war doesn't change the map much, but what ends up happening after all of this time between 1967 and 1978, as Ross mentions, we get to the Camp David Accords. And the Camp David Accords, even though it doesn't solve everything, what it first does, it's the first peace treaty between an Arab country and Israel, and it's Egypt. Egypt says, I will recognize you, Israel, as a right to exist. And Israel said, okay, we will give you back the entire Sinai Peninsula. So you get all your land back. So this is that land for peace deal, but it's just only Egypt at this point in time. Oh, let's see. Now here are some more photos from Ross. He is the photo guy. Absolutely. All right. So there's a flag over Masada. And I think a lot of you know what Masada is all about. This is back in the ancient time when they were fighting the Romans, and they fought to the last person. They wouldn't ever give up. This is part of that Israeli psyche that's there. The Holocaust Museum, the pictures of where they're trying to actually identify who each one of these people were of the 6 million. And Israeli soldiers in Jerusalem. So it's security, like the real estate, they say, what's the, what was it, location, location, and location? Well, in Israel, it's security, security, and security.
Okay, fourth declaration, and you can see the fifth below that, 1982, the Israel invasion of Lebanon. I kind of plan to read you the author's experience here, but we're running just a bit late, so maybe I won't do that. But I'll just tell you that at this time, he is a professor in Beirut, and he's in a meeting on a Friday, and all of a sudden they hear these bombs, huge bombs landing in southern Beirut, Lebanon. So the meeting breaks up. He gets in his car to pick up his 2 daughters in nursery school and in another in like 1st grade. He worries about his wife who's down near where the bombing is taking place. And she's in a job there. So he just does get his daughters. His wife decides instead of going to the bomb shelter, she's going to try to make it home because she's afraid she'll get stuck there. And she starts running out on the roads because everyone's running. And I guess she had a cab. She didn't have a car, but she does find a cab that'll take her the rest of the way. And then he goes into some detail about how much destruction happened in Lebanon southern Beirut, or a lot of Beirut during this time. It really kind of brings this all to life. So I give you the short version of it, but it's kind of a harrowing read if you try to put yourself into the author's shoes. So massive Israeli shelling at Beirut, 10 weeks of terrible conflict. Sharon and Menachem Begin intended to defeat the PLO, but for this author, they actually empowered the PLO. They kind of militarily defeated them, but gave them a lot more status. Another outcome of this is, you've heard of the terrorist group Hezbollah up there. Well, they were founded after this occurred. Then I'll go to the fifth declaration. They call this the first intifada. Intifada means uprising. So just kind of a natural uprising of people. In 1987 to 95, there were Palestinian uprising all over the West Bank and Gaza. This resulted in the Oslo Accords or Framework, 1993, splitting the West Bank and Gaza into 3 sections, A, B, and C. You know, I really have a good feeling about the Oslo Accords. I thought that was a real triumph until I read this book and started to understand it more. And I'll mention to you these sections. C was an easy one. That was given to Israel, but A and B, I'll show you on a map in a minute. And then that's the source of a lot of conflicts today. And the author says the key focus is always Israel's security.
Okay, now, 1982 to 1993, and as Ross was talking about, the war shifts to Lebanon, but why? Why is the war shift to Lebanon? It's because the PLO moved to Lebanon and started launching their attacks from Lebanon into Syria. And then ultimately, then again, once attacked, the Israelis then launch into Lebanon and they win the war. They end up pushing the PLO out. And so now the PLO are exiled from Lebanon, but there's a lot, Ariel Sharon was their defense minister, and he decided, he's a little bit like Pat, or McCarthy, I'm gonna just keep on going. And they went all the way into Beirut. It's pretty nasty. And there's a lot, and Hezbollah came out of all that. And so as Ross said, the Israelis won the war, but it hardened the opposition, I think, with the Palestinian side. The Oslo Accords, were never intended to stop where they are now. The West Bank makes no sense. It has all these different A, B, and C areas. But the Oslo Accord was important for 3 reasons. One, it has first established the right of governance. The Arab countries said, okay, that Israel could govern, and Israel said that not the PLO, but the PA, they changed the name. The Palestinian Authority actually could have authority over Gaza and the West Bank. So you're really getting the Palestinians to the table, and you're actually getting recognition of each other. They shook hands, Yasser Arafat and Rabin, and so all of that was there. Then the Palestinian Authority was given that partial administration, and then at the end, Jordan and Israel signed a peace treaty. But the accords were only supposed to be the first step. There was supposed to be a series over the next, I think it was to 2005. There was supposed to be a series of confidence building so that ultimately there would be a 2-state solution.
This is just a section of the map we were given a year ago. You can see it's folded, and now on here you can't see it at all. But you can see enough of it. In the middle of it is the West Bank, and you can see different colors on there. You can see yellow, and then maybe a darker color when you talk about the A sections and the B sections, they're defined over there. And the A sections are completely under Palestinian control. And these days, I think they have walls all around that section. You can't get out. The B section is a little more complicated. It has Palestinian responsibilities for a lot, but then Israeli is responsible for security of Israelis. So that's the yellow section. So I showed you earlier a map of the West Bank, all kind of one area. This is reality today. If you want to look at my map, I got it up here. But it's kind of a real hodgepodge, and it's kind of a mess. But that is reality. So 2000, no, we almost got up to the current state. This is the last declaration of war, or the last chapter. After Oslo, for the perspective of the Palestinian author, things get much worse. Lots of travel restrictions were the worst in Gaza. He was given examples of people who used to work in Israel and live in Gaza. Well, that's not possible anymore. And it's not possible in Bethlehem anymore, in a lot of the West Bank. And then the PLO's more militant rival, Hamas, forms in Gaza. It's really an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and other places. So we've seen Hezbollah form, we've seen Hamas form kind of in reaction to some of this. Powder keg is set off when Sharon visits the Temple Mount in the center of Jerusalem. And the second Intifada, or uprising, starts in 2000, last 8 years. In Gaza, in early 2000s, Israel pulled out completely. And they thought maybe Gaza could govern themselves with a democracy. And they set up an election in the year 2006. Hamas ran a full slate of people in that election, and they won. That was actually a surprise to people, but they won, so they're kind of in control, and that's the last election they've had in Gaza, and they've maintained their control ever since then. So much destruction and death in Gaza. This is before our current situation, and Hamas sending missiles into Israel.
So now, from the perspective of Israel, the second Intifada really ups the conflict in terms of suicide bombers indiscriminately killing Israeli civilians. So what happened was Israel reacted by retaking parts of the West Bank and Gaza for security purposes, and they started building walls and to keep the suicide bombers, and to put more and more restrictions on the commerce going back and forth, as Ross is describing. So again, it's this security thing that Israel feels compelled to do as the second Intifada happens. There is another war in fact, we've even skipped a couple wars. There's the Suez War, but so another war in Lebanon, and then there's a UN buffer zone established. But Israel, at the end of all this, in 2005, Israel leaves Gaza. So we're out, and we'll put the walls up. Let's do that. Let's try that. But as Ross just indicated, as soon as they left, then Hamas comes in. But another thing that's interesting is the Jewish settlements that were in Gaza were all removed. You actually have Jewish people living in Gaza in these settlements. And see, settlements are going to be a problem in the long term to be able to deal with the West Bank. But there is a precedent here, though, where basically Israel left, so we're out, and we got all the settlements gone. So I think little glimmer, you know, to try and look for something, but perhaps.
Who here has heard of the artist Banksy? You know, actually, I barely heard of him before a year ago, but this is one of his works on a wall of a building. It's actually not on a wall, it's on a building in Bethlehem in the West Bank. And I think it's really clever. On the right side, you see it says, "Welcome to Palestine, welcome to Bethlehem." And it's a dove with an olive branch, so it's a symbol of peace, but you might not be able to see, he's also got a bulletproof vest on. And you probably can't see this, but he's in the sights of a rifle. There's a circle in there in red. So the only thing I observed with that is the rifle is pointing at the bulletproof vest, which is probably a good thing. But if we wanted to discuss art, we could spend some time on this one. Okay, so we're kind of done with these books, kind of a summary. We've got a couple of summaries here at the end. One is additional points and factors from Khalidi. This is good, I think. He says, no matter the history, there are now two peoples in Palestine. Their mutual acceptance can only be based on complete equality of rights. There is no other possible sustainable solution, barring the unthinkable notion of one people's extermination or expulsion by the other. And
Summarizing Noah's book, she said there are three recommendations that she would make: encourage investment in the Palestine economy. And she really believed, she had a lot of conversation about that, how that could be the secret sauce to be able to make some progress. Shrink the conflict means get actors like Iran out of the picture, maybe even the United States. There are too many competing actors. Try to get back to the Israelis and the Palestinians themselves. And then thirdly, develop responsible Palestinian leadership. Now, Ed would add perhaps responsible leadership on both sides. But particularly on the Arab side, it's been Yasser Arafat. The current leader of the PA is 88 years old. He's even older than our guys. And yeah. So, and then the other option's Hamas. So you really have got to the idea of getting reasonable, moderate leadership on both sides to be able to find a path for peace. I think we're ending about at the right time. It's 11:15. We have one more chart, which is Ed and my kind of conclusions. It's an exceedingly complicated situation. I think just sitting through this, or you're probably impressed with that. Many entities and countries all have an interest in this conflict. Jewish and Palestinian people, plus all the surrounding countries, plus the United States. It's a mess, kind of. Both sides have a claim to the land, but both have they could say they're indigenous, and there's some truth in that. And both sides are victims of major injustices and feel them deeply. There's one example here from Israel's perspective, and I copied it from Time magazine. The Hamas massacre, that just occurred recently, activated the 2,000-year-old communal history of persecution every Jew carries. We are trained in trauma. And so both sides feel hatred toward the other for all the atrocities that have happened. Both sides have extremists. And I wanted to share that right after the Camp David peace accord, that was Anwar Sadat. 3 years later, he's murdered by the Muslim Brotherhood, by the extreme on the Arab side. And then with Oslo, 2 years after Oslo, Yitzhak Rabin is murdered by the right-wing Israeli. And both of these leaders stepped out and tried to find peace. They were both assassinated by their own people. But we're not going to leave you on a bad place. So, all right, see these little kids sitting here? All right, we don't know whether they're Christian, whether they're Arabs, whether they're Jews, or maybe it's a mixture. But we believe that we don't want to have those children and their children's children condemned to more war, and more war. And so let's hope that we'll find a
resolution.
a equitable resolution to this problem.
Thank you very much.